Fanatical ideologies, especially those tied to religion and nationalism, often view acts of kindness from enemies as tactical necessities rather than opportunities for reconciliation. Though the leader may express gratitude for a life-saving act, the larger ideological battle takes precedence over personal interactions. Despite acts of goodwill, the commitment to violent resistance remains, highlighting the difficulty of changing deeply ingrained beliefs. These ideologies often dehumanize the other side, justifying violence even after receiving help.
On him. In my view, it is not Netanyahu who's uncompromising. It's Hamas that's uncompromising. They could have handed back the hostages last October. They could have not done this. I mean, they could have tried to build a state since 2005 when Israel withdrew from the Gaza and handed the place over to them. Hamas could have used the billions of dollars and pounds and euros that British and European and American taxpayers gave them since 2006. They could have used those billions of dollars to build up Gaza. They could have made a booming, in the good sense of the term, Mediterranean paradise. They could have created wealth for their people. But you know what they did? They built down instead of upwards. They built a tunnel network bigger than the London Underground for all of those years, and they squirreled away the money, just like Yasser Arafat did before them, and they made themselves rich. Why was Ismail Haniyeh worth billions of dollars? Why does Khaled Mashal, why is he worth billions of dollars? Why are their children like princelings who live in apartment complexes in Doha? Because they took the money of Americans and Brits and Europeans and they took it for themselves and kept the people of Gaza in immiseration and poverty. There has been since 2005 a complete counterfactual of what could have happened. But the Hamas leadership didn't want that. They have said themselves they want to use Palestinian children and their lives in order to pressurize the world. These are fanatics. They want the death of their own citizens. In order to get world opinion turned against Israel.
I completely agree with Murray's argument. Hamas has completely used us and UK aid money for personal gain. Douglas Murray has frequently criticized Hamas for its handling of international aid, particularly in the context of Gaza's persistent underdevelopment. His main argument is that instead of using the billions in aid from various international donors to build a sustainable infrastructure and improve the living conditions of Gaza's citizens, Hamas has diverted these funds toward military objectives. Murray highlights that a large portion of aid to Gaza has been diverted to building terror tunnels used for smuggling weapons and militants, rather than addressing civilian needs. These tunnels, costing millions, are used in attacks on Israel, but have not improved Gaza's economy or society. Donors and aid organizations are frustrated by this misuse of funds intended for development, which has undermined trust between international supporters and Palestinian authorities. Murray argues that Gaza could have thrived with investments in infrastructure, but Hamas chose militarization over development. Despite international aid, Gaza remains underdeveloped and unstable due to this focus on conflict. Instead of improving hospitals, schools, or employment, aid has been directed to Hamas military. Gaza still faces power shortages, water scarcity, and poor public services, despite ongoing donations.
Israel, again, how do you negotiate with that? The assumption always is in the West today, because we're so sort of fat and lazy in our expectation that peace is the norm and that historically it's the norm. We're so full of our own expectations and presumptions that we always think that wars end by some kind of compromise and coming around the table, to use the cliche. They don't. Historically, most wars end because one side wins and one side loses. And one of the reasons, in my view, why there is this endless rounds of war in this region is because the Israelis are never allowed to win, and Hamas, in this case, are always allowed to draw. And I think that is simply to set up the precursor for the next conflict. If Hamas come out of this with a fighting capability, then there will be another round of this war in a couple of years. So when David Lammy and others say what we need to have is a peace deal, I'd say on what terms? Everybody wants peace except for Hamas and the fanatics. Everybody else wants peace. All of these people in the south, these kibbutzniks and the party-goers and others who were murdered on the 7th, all dreamed of peace with their Palestinian neighbors and brothers and sisters. Who stopped that peace being possible? Hamas, from 2005 and again to this very day.
Murray criticizes the international community, especially organizations like the UN, for not doing enough to pressure Hamas to demilitarize. In his view, the failure to effectively sanction Hamas for its militant activities and misuse of aid emboldens the group to continue its resistance against Israel. He also believes that international bodies have been too quick to equate Israeli defensive actions with Hamas's offensives, creating a false parity between a recognized state and a non-state actor engaged in terrorism. Murray observes that international actors, particularly in Europe and the UN, often shield Hamas from the full consequences of its actions by calling for ceasefires or condemning Israeli responses. This, he argues, prevents Israel from fully neutralizing Hamas' military threat. Murray argues that premature ceasefires allow Hamas to regroup and rearm, thereby prolonging the conflict instead of resolving it. Murray frequently highlights how the media and international organizations often treat Israel and Hamas as morally equivalent, ignoring the fact that Hamas intentionally targets civilians, while Israel's military actions are primarily defensive. This narrative, according to Murray, helps Hamas maintain its fighting capability because it shifts public sympathy away from Israel's efforts to defend itself. Murray highlights Hamas's use of civilians as human shields, placing military targets in populated areas to provoke civilian casualties and international condemnation of Israel. This tactic limits Israel's ability to strike without triggering global outcry. Murray argues that media coverage often focuses on Palestinian casualties, overlooking Hamas's role in provoking and sustaining the conflict. Murray acknowledges the difficult position Israel is in, where it must defend itself from constant rocket attacks and incursions, but is often restricted by international diplomacy. He argues that Israel's inability to decisively eliminate Hamas is partly due to global pressure to avoid civilian casualties, which Hamas deliberately causes by embedding itself in civilian areas. Murray argues that Israel is in a catch-22. Responding too strongly brings international condemnation, while insufficient force allows Hamas to grow stronger, preventing a decisive victory. Despite its military strength, Israel is often limited by concerns over global opinion and humanitarian consequences, which hinders its ability to fully neutralize Hamas.
I think it's a cynical and easy explanation that, as it were, the war is going on because Netanyahu simply wants to remain in power. He's already the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. So, I don't think he particularly needs to stay in power. We can look into the psychology of him, but there's not much point. And as for the trials and so on, we'll see what happens with that. But the thing that is surprising to me is that people don't see that you can put pressure, exert pressure on a democratically elected leader very easily in any democracy. And that is where people tend to apply pressure because they have the right to. But as I say, we've been in this situation before in other democracies. We've had it in Britain as well. If there's nothing you can do about a terrorist group, it's quite commonplace to put the anger and level the blame at democratically elected leaders on whose watch things have happened. That's just inevitable, but it's one of the things that democracies have to be aware of when they're dealing with death cults like Hamas, is the death cults operate by a totally different standard than the standards of the democracies. And all of the difference in the world exists in that gap.
The tension you describe between democracies and groups like Hamas stems from the vastly different standards and systems under which they operate, which can complicate conflict resolution. Democracies are held accountable by their citizens, subject to international law, and generally operate with transparency, while groups like Hamas follow a different set of rules, often operating outside of international norms. In democratic nations, elected leaders are held accountable by the public and face pressure from various institutions, including the media, courts, and international organizations, to act within the bounds of law, human rights, and ethical standards. When crises occur, such as conflicts involving Hamas, democratic leaders face scrutiny and criticism from their citizens if their actions are perceived as too aggressive or too lenient. In democracies, leaders must balance military objectives with the need to avoid civilian casualties, respect international law, and consider public opinion. In contrast, Hamas operates without public oversight, focusing on military goals and making unilateral decisions, allowing it to take extreme actions without the same level of accountability as democratic governments. In democratic nations, political leaders must consider the consequences of military actions on their re-election prospects and public support. Leaders may be hesitant to escalate conflicts if they believe it will result in a loss of political capital or voter support, especially when public sentiment is strongly against prolonged war. Douglas Murray's argument centers on the idea that the ongoing conflict in Gaza persists because Hamas has been allowed to maintain and expand its military capabilities. He believes that international efforts to promote peace have failed because they have not addressed the root issue: Hamas's continued militarization and its commitment to Israel's destruction. According to Murray, for there to be lasting peace, Hamas must be decisively disarmed or defeated, and only then can diplomatic efforts succeed in creating a stable, prosperous Gaza. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join our free Telegram group, linked in the description, where we can discuss important issues freely and without censorship, and support each other. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member for exclusive content.